Welcome to the Do This for Life podcast with OEV of Be Truly Faithful. I will be in your ear every Wednesday, encouraging ladies to do love, relationships, family, nation building, and good sex for life. Yes, this is where you get to do this for life, y'all. Woo! So let's go into today's broadcast. All right, so thank you for tuning in today. And today's podcast is about my mind or my marriage. Now, I know that the title of the podcast can be sounding a little perplexing, but there is a reason for it, okay? There's a reason for it. On my last podcast, I am sure those who listened, the title was, Can Marriage Cause Mental Health Issues in Women? Can marriage cause mental health issues in women? If y'all did not listen to that, it's probably best to listen to that one first before going further with this. But I also understand sometimes we can listen to things out of order and still it'd be cool, you know? So let's talk about it. And when I was talking about marriage causing mental health issues in women, if that was true or not, that was the question. I covered the different types of abuse in marriage. Now, there were the ones you always hear of. You know, that's the norm, which is physical abuse and verbal abuse. But I mentioned some others that oftentimes don't get talked about, don't really get discussed. I mentioned economic abuse. I mentioned physical abuse, of course, and verbal abuse, of course. But also there's emotional abuse, academic abuse, psychological abuse, technological abuse, as well as the one that I did not talk about was sexual abuse. I felt like sexual abuse was pretty obvious, so I didn't really mention it. But last week, that's what I talked about on the podcast. Now, I want y'all to understand something. The reason why I mentioned and said, can marriage cause mental health issues in women? It was not to alienate or leave out those ladies who are not married but are in relationships or have been in relationships. It was basically because oftentimes it is harder for women to leave a marriage than just a relationship. Even though both are hard to do, if you get caught up in a relationship so much and get caught up in that man, it is hard to leave no matter what state you're in. But it is harder for women in marriages because many women who marry today still believe that divorce is a no. You know, don't divorce, that you are to be married for life. You're not to end your marriage and you don't break covenants. So oftentimes it can be harder for women to leave a marriage, especially if their husband is the abuser and he's pushing the submission narrative where the wife is to submit always. So in these situations, things are actually getting worse, but fortunately, yet unfortunately, things are getting more exposure because things are getting worse. And what that means is it's unfortunate that any woman has to go through this for it to get exposure, but then we have to look at the bright side and find the silver lining that fortunately these things are getting more exposure so that women can get help, so they can be talked about, so that discussions can be had. So I'm starting discussions on these things and I'm bringing awareness by doing podcasts, by doing posts and things like that, talking about it, so that hopefully it will catch the ear of a woman who's in the situation, in any of these situations I'm bringing up, and they will reach out for help. So that's the narrative I'm pushing, is that there's help available. Do y'all know that even back in the day, like in some of our parents' time and the grandparents' time, when abuse was happening in marriages, especially physical abuse, they had no one to really reach out to. Oftentimes they were met with, just pray for your husband, just hang in there, things will get better, or he's just being a man, or he's got a lot on him, and all these types of excuses being made for the abuser, but no compassion was shown towards the abusee. I can give y'all some movies. I'm going to be giving y'all some resources today that y'all can easily look up, but also just take a look at The Burning Bed. It's a movie with the late Farrah Fawcett in it. It's a very old movie. I actually saw this movie when I was younger and it affected me in such a negative way because I was going through that in my own household. So it was hard to watch, but I did. And I have not watched it since because it's very hard to watch those types of movies when there's abuse in them, especially physical abuse, because, I have a history in physical abuse that I will share another time. Now, let's talk about it. We were talking about mental health and abuse in marriage. I want to further talk on that today because I want to encourage some ladies. So if you go to the National Domestic Violence Hotline, it's making several statements on here. You ladies, you can really find out so much about abuse. So right now, this is going to talk more about physical abuse and then it mentions of sexual abuse, but you can still get the gist that abuse is the common factor here. Listen what it says. Since abusive behaviors happen primarily in one's intimate partner relationship, it's common that an abusive partner will not show their negative or harmful behaviors with friends, coworkers, or family members. An abusive partner tends to put on what can be considered a fake mask for the rest of the world to see. When it's just the victim and the abusive partner together, that mask comes off, and the victim sees a different side that others aren't allowed to see. The impact of being the only person to see this behavior is often isolating for the victim, as they may think, or the abusive person may even say, that no one else will believe them since no one else has witnessed the abusive behaviors. This also makes it easier for the abusive person to make their partner feel responsible for their abusive behavior, which enforces the isolation. Did y'all hear that? Abusive people tend to be fake when the world is watching. When they're around their family members or whatever, they tend to be fake. They tend to put on a mask. But when they're alone with their abuser, the mask comes off and the victim sees a different side. So you hear these ladies say, well, I didn't see this before marriage. And you're like, how could you not see it? Well, they probably put on a mask. Now, that doesn't mean they don't have traits. Now, this is the thing about abusive partners. It doesn't mean they don't show traits, that they can be abusive. It doesn't mean they don't show that. It's just that many times it is kind of put off, and men are oftentimes given the benefit of the doubt, depending on the type of charm they have or personality. But they do put on for others that are not, not the abusee. But so even before marriage or getting into the relationship, women have seen these sides, certain sides of these men. They've seen these sides of them because they were alone with them. Okay. So they put on the mask for others, not the person that they abuse. All right. Now, in the beginning, of course, when you're just meeting, of course, they're putting on for everybody, even the woman that they're meeting. But after some time, they show themselves even to that woman. All right. So now listen to this. It is now generally recognized that experiencing domestic violence and abuse is associated with mental health problems, including anxiety and depression. These issues can make the abusive situation even worse. Now the partner, the one who's doing the abusing, may make use of a mental health diagnosis. For example, telling someone, you know what, you're crazy. You really are crazy. You need help. You know what, you're mad. You know what I mean? They're now using that against you. If you have anxiety or depression, they'll blame you and they'll bring it up to you, make you feel even worse. And it can be also difficult for health professionals to see beyond the mental health issues and to recognize that an abusive relationship may be at the heart of the problems. So what's happening is that it's so difficult to deal with because health professionals too are just trying to deal with the depression or the anxiety. And sometimes they're missing the root cause of it. Because oftentimes they'll just medicate or have you do some things, but they need to talk a little bit more and find out the root cause of it. Because now they're starting to make links and connections with abuse and mental health issues. All right. So it's important for professionals to recognize the wider impacts for those living in an abusive relationship and are able to offer the appropriate support. So being that I am ministerial counselor and life coaching, this is where we have to, I'm not professional like the professionals, but this is where we have to, when people are when ladies are talking to me, I have to read between the lines a lot. I have to use discernment. I have to utilize the Holy Spirit even, because some women don't know their abuse. I've talked to several women here lately that didn't know they was being economically abused. They didn't even know it because it's not really talked about. Most women know when they're being physically abused. They know that it's wrong, but many of them don't know about the economic abuse, which we're going to talk about a little bit more. So listen, when they interview these women who suffer from anxiety and depression, many have been on medication to treat the depression, right? And many women were concerned that a diagnosis of mental health issues could be used by their partners against them in child residency and contact proceedings. So like if they want to divorce their husband, they won't. They're afraid to because the husband uses her diagnosis of mental health issues and being on medication for depression. They use that against her. So he threatens her with that and she stays. And then she has to, quote unquote, endure more abuse. Because most oftentimes mothers really love their children. Because when they're in abusive marriages and abusive relationships, oftentimes their children are the only ones who's really kind of loving them and treating them right, as children normally do, right? Especially if they're very young. They just love on mama. But when the husband or the boyfriend, long-term boyfriend or whatever is not doing that and they want to leave, they will believe these men coming against them and using their mental health issue against them to make them stay. And therefore, they don't feel like they can leave. They feel trapped. Okay. Now, there are some positive stories out here in this where they receive help, and that's why it needs to be talked about. Depression and anxiety is unfortunately becoming something of the norm, and many women are being medicated for it. Okay. So we don't want those things to be used against these ladies. This is why we need to have more discussions about these types of things. Is any of this related to being in a relationship with someone who's being heartless and cruel? Because some women even describe how the depression and anxiety they experienced carried on after leaving the relationship. So let's say the ladies finally left the relationship. They're still dealing with the depression and anxiety. See, sometimes they were not always sure at first what was wrong with them. Like one lady was talking about, she kept bursting into tears. Like she left the guy, but she kept bursting into tears. She wasn't able to sleep. She was having insomnia. And she would wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning with the scrambled egg brain. And she was saying she was just a wreck. She was bursting into tears all the time, just any and everywhere. So understand that even after leaving the relationship, women described experiencing panic attacks. They would have flashbacks or nightmares about the abuse. They even resulted to self-harm, and they suffered from post-traumatic stress syndrome. All those things happening to them makes it difficult to socialize or trust other people. So you have to understand when abuse is happening in a marriage or relationship and a woman is suffering, she's at the very hands of this, it's hard for her to trust other people. It makes it difficult for her to socialize. Who can she trust, right? She was in a relationship, gave her a heart in this relationship, and she trusted this man, but now who can she trust? Who's gonna talk to her and support her? Okay. One lady said she felt angry with her ex because he made her less trusting of people. Like she couldn't trust anyone. She thought everyone was out to get her. Okay. So we got to start talking about this more and more. So should you choose your mind or your marriage? Should you choose your mind or your relationship? Mind or marriage? We should be able to have both. If we're committed in a loving relationship, we should have both. We're being put in a position where we're having to choose. It's not fair. And there are lots of things that can be done before this even comes into play. This is why I push having a support system, a strong support system in place, whether it includes parents and best friends and mentors or whatever. Having that in place helps you to see what you can't see. Now, let me say that better. Helps you to see what you can't see. That means that your support system can be your eyes to see what you don't see. So they're your eyes for you. Because what do? We get emotionally attached to these men. We in love with them so much. We're just in awe of them. But our support system can see things we don't see. Our best friend can see something. Well, I don't know about that right there. Something looks funny. Our dads or our father figures can definitely see and check these men, depending on who you got in your support system now. Not all fathers can do that, but there's some that can check because they know the games and the things they dealt with and the things they did when they were younger or whatnot. Mentors are excellent to have just in case you don't have supportive parents or whatnot, because, it's not a perfect world. So we got all kinds of things that we have to deal with. Mothers are there for guidance. Fathers are there for guidance. Mother or father figures, friends that are like your prayer partners, your spiritual accountability partners and things of that nature. Okay, so we need to be building strong support systems, and I'll talk about that soon one day too. We need mentors. We need to be having people in our circle who can help us see and call out these men. The modern day church is kind of failing in this because they want to see people married. They don't want people to have sex before marriage, things like that. So they're like, you need to get married. And people are getting married to avoid quote unquote sin, or people are getting married to the guys that, ladies are getting married to the guys that look good on the outside, that go to church. Oftentimes these men aren't going to church. I talked to several ladies of Nigerian descent. They're Nigerian culture, and their husbands are abusing them, yet they are ministers and pastors and deacons. So, we got to do a better job of how we're sending, quote unquote, women into marriage. I know some of you are like, well, women are choosing. Yes, I know that. But what I'm saying is, especially if you're a Christian and the church is there, why is there such a high rate of violence, of abuse against women in the quote unquote church? Okay. And then we talk about divorce, right? We talk about divorce and talk about how the rates are so high with divorce, especially of those who are Christian. And so we're pushing that narrative about divorce when we're not asking why are these people getting divorced and talking about that. what we do instead is we talk about how bad it is, how marriage is not staying together. And so these ladies feel pressured to remain so they won't be another statistic, so they won't look bad in the church. I don't know how many times I've talked to women who were told to stay and pray. And then if they weren't told that, they were even just afraid to reach out for help because divorce is often brought up and preached like you shouldn't divorce and this, that, and the other. I mean, it's so much there, but a lot of ladies are struggling with mental disorders from the abuse they're receiving in their relationships or their marriages. They said in the National Institute of Mental Health that 1 in 4 adults suffer from diagnosable mental disorders. 54 to 80% of battered women suffer from post-traumatic stress syndrome. 63 to 77% of battered women experience depression and anxiety. Do y'all hear me? 38 to 75% experience anxiety alone. Why are these rates so high? Did you know on the womenshealth.gov, violence against women can cause long-term physical and mental health problems? Did y'all hear that? Long-term physical and mental health problems. Violence and abuse affect not just women involved, but also their children. And that's where I come in, which I'll share on that another time. It affects their families and communities. It doesn't just affect them, y'all. It affects everyone. It affects everyone. These effects include harm to an individual's health, possibly long-term harm to children, and harm to communities such as lost work and homelessness. If ladies are experiencing a physical or sexual assault, they will feel many emotions. They will feel fear, confusion, anger, or even being numb and not feeling much of anything. They will emotionally disconnect. They will feel guilt and shame over being assaulted by their husbands, by their boyfriends. And some people try to minimize the abuse or hide it by covering bruises and making excuses for the abuser. This happens way too often. So the long-term mental health effects of violence against women can include post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety. These are things we already talked about. Other effects can include shutting people out, not wanting to do things you once enjoyed, not being able to trust others, and having low self-esteem. This is one of the biggest things I've seen with women in abuse is low self-esteem. And so what do? Many of these women who have experienced violence, cope with it by using drugs, drinking alcohol, smoking, or here's a big one, overeating. So we want to talk about all these women being heavy set and overweight and morbid obese, and we're not looking at the root cause of it. They're having issues, mental health issues. How do we know they haven't been abused? Now they're being made fun of because they're overweight. It's just so much, y'all. And I'm not saying that's the only reason women are overweight. I'm saying we got to look at and connect the dots on many of these things, all right? Because when they use substance like drugs or whatnot, a lot of research has shown that 90% of the women with substance use problems have experienced physical or sexual violence, and they're using it to make them feel better. But in the end, it makes them feel worse, especially in the long term, okay? Now look, physical and sexual assaults or threats to commit them are the most apparent forms of relationship abuse and are usually the actions that allow others to become aware of the problem. However, regular use of other abusive behaviors by the abuser make up a larger system of abuse. There is a system of abuse. Have y'all ever heard of IPV? That is called intimate partner violence. Intimate partner violence, IPV. It's one of the most common forms of violence against women, and it's performed by a husband or an intimate male partner. IPV is a serious public health problem associated with physical, reproductive, and mental health consequences. There are women who have lost children, having miscarriage from the abuse in marriage. Not always physical, by the way. Not always physical. So remember, we mentioned last podcast about emotional and psychological. Now, the rates are pretty broad, but they're saying between 15 to 71% of women reported experience IPV over their lifetime. So various forms of abuse generally coexist within the same relationship, okay? IPV is commonly conceptualized as a pattern of coercive behaviors in a relationship whereby one partner uses tactics of power and control, remember I said this last podcast, over the other partner over a period of time. This is not something that happens one time. This happens over time. That's why if there's a fight or something and y'all hit each other one time, that's not abuse. That's just y'all getting angry and doing things y'all shouldn't do when you're angry. But if these things are happening over time, if the man is hitting on you over time, if he's verbally abusing you over time, if he's economically abusing you over time, this is a problem, okay? This is a problem. Now check this out. Despite the abundant literature on the different types of abuse, very few have focused on economic abuse. Remember I mentioned it earlier? Scholars are starting to stress that there's a need to include economic abuse as a form of IPV. Why? Well, given the nature of behaviors such as employment sabotage economic control and economic exploitation, this needs to be talked about more. Common tactics of control in IPV that is common as physical and psychological abuse. These are things that are common tactics of control. It's as common as physical and psychological abuse. It's just not talked about as much. So, okay, now listen to what it says here. I believe this is from thehotline.com. Defined as the control of a woman's ability to acquire, use, and maintain economic resources, thus threatening her economic security and potential for self-sufficiency. It is a coercive behavior that makes the victim economically dependent on her partner and at greater risk of continued abuse. Why? Because by controlling women's ability to acquire, use, and maintain economic resources, economic abuse threatens victims' economic security and ability to achieve economic independence. When women do not have economic independence, what do they become? Economic dependent. If they don't have economic independence, they become economically dependent. So then what happens? Listen what happens. To establish a state of economic dependence, an abuser might take control of a woman's resources by preventing her from obtaining and maintaining employment outside the home, causing her job absence or loss by showing up at her workplace, preventing women's use of existing resources by controlling resource distribution and use, denying them access to joint bank accounts or financial information, and exploiting a woman's resources by stealing her money, creating costs, and generating debt, thereby depleting her economic resources. Y'all, I want to talk about this. I shared in the last podcast how there was a woman who has a high up position and her husband literally would come up on her job to threaten her. He would threaten all of her coworkers as well, whether she was there or not. And you may say, well, if she's not there, that it's not as bad. Listen, it is very bad because her coworkers were getting threatened. They were being threatened as well. And so what's going to happen? They're going to let the board members know. They're going to let the people know this is what's going on because they no longer feel safe. So then what happens next? They lose that job and they try to get another one. It's almost like she's blackballed. It's like where her husband keeps coming up on the job. That's economic abuse. Even if he doesn't physically hurt her. Yeah, there's stories just like that. What about the ladies? I've talked to some ladies in Nigeria who are home with the children and the husband takes care of all the children's needs and gives the woman no money. No access to the money. And I remember a young wife even telling me that she did not even have enough money to get sanitary napkins to use for herself. That's economic abuse. It's a power trip, y'all. It's a power trip. Did you know economic abuse can lead to poverty? Yeah, for women. Women, especially Black women, are some of the highest of those in poverty, which in turn, so if economic abuse can lead to poverty, in turn, it's a risk factor for further economic abuse. That means that even if she gets out of one relationship, she's looking for a man to kind of get her out of that economic poverty situation. And so then she gets with another man and just repeats the cycle. He has control over her financially too. So in addition to creating financial dependence, economic abuse creates a hostile environment where the abused woman is continually psychological distress and anxious about material or financial issues. So so how can she leave the relationship? Remember what I said? It's harder for those in marriage to leave a relationship than it is not, but it's still hard for both. Leaving these types of relationships become difficult. And there's been studies that found this stress to be linked with depression, anxiety, and also parenting her own children. And guess what else? The risk for suicidal ideation or attempts increases with IPV severity. Y'all, this is real. So what do we choose? Our mind or our marriage? Our mind or our relationships? If you find yourself losing your mind, it's time to choose your mind. I am not telling you to get a divorce. I am very pro-marriage. The thing is, I am anti-abuse. I am not anti-marriage. I am anti-abuse. I am pro-marriage. I'm just anti-abuse. I'm saying that over and over again because I want people to get it. I am not telling women to divorce. I have been accused by men who have actually put their wives in these situations because we have talked to them in private, but I've been accused by a few men of being anti-marriage, or have you used to believe in permanence view of marriage and now you're anti-marriage. It's not that I no longer hold the permanence view. It's that I no longer believe it's marriage or not. When I say marriage or not, I wrote a post on that and that was the title. But what I'm saying is it's no longer, when there's abuse involved, I'm no longer for saving the marriage. I am for saving the woman and empowering and equipping and inspiring and lifting her and being there for her so that she can make the best decision for her life. I will do what I can in ministerial counseling and life coaching. After that, she may need professional counseling to make the best decision. I want to be a part of her team to help her make the best decision. I want her to choose her mind. Because at the end of the day, you can lose your marriage and still have your mind. But if you lose your mind and keep your marriage, what do you really have? What do you really have if you lose your mind and still be in a marriage that has a lot of IPV going on? Well, how good are you going to be for your children? How good are you going to be for yourself? How will you actively participate in society and be a part of society and bring change and solutions to society when you cannot get your anxiety under control, when you cannot get your depression under control, when your abuser is constantly mocking you for having mental health issues that he is a great part of starting in you, when you were raised healthy and doing well, and then you get with him and this is what happens. Now, I'm not saying that a lot of these issues didn't start when we were growing up, because if we grew up in abusive homes, many of us do repeat the cycle. But the buck gotta stop with you. If your husband is economically abusing you, your boyfriend is physically abusing you, your husband is academically abusing you, making fun of you, belittling your academic achievements. They're little to nothing compared to his and whatnot. And when you go back to school or things like that, they demand that you be home, or they tell you that you're taking up too much of your time. You're not home with your children. They use it against you because you're trying to better yourself. See, abusers don't like for abusees to better themselves. It is an attack against their ego. They don't want you to get better. They want you to stay just like you are, so they can control you. They understand that if you get educated more than what you are, for whatever the reason, that will deduce their power. Education actually reduces power of abusers because you're educated now. So now you know better. When you have a strong support system, oftentimes we won't even enter into these kind of relationships. But let's just say by happenstance, we get, when we're not listening to our support system and we do, then guess what? Now we got people who are looking out for us. They're looking out for us and they're calling things out, and we no longer can stand by and say we didn't know. I understand that most of us don't know what economic abuse is, and that's why I'm sounding the alarm, so you'll know, okay? Because as Monique says, I love us for real. Ladies, I love us for real. I love us for real. And I watched my mother for years growing up be abused. For years, be physically abused, verbally abused, emotionally abused, even economically abused when she was the breadwinner. My dad had control of the money and he could squander it whenever he wanted to. So I'm going to talk more about this. I'm not going to stop talking about this, y'all. I'm not saying I'm going to talk about it every podcast, but I'm saying when I'm moved and it hits me to talk, I'm talking. I'm talking about it. And I want y'all to talk about it too. Please share this podcast. I appreciate you sharing the previous ones. Thank you so much. Last week's podcast was the most shared podcast yet. I really appreciate it. And I really appreciate all of you for tuning in once again. I have more to speak on this, but I just got to get it, I gotta end it for today. So we did it again. Another podcast completed. Thank you so much again for taking time out to listen. And I want you to share this, okay? I appreciate you for sharing it for last week. Let's share this week too, because it helps in bringing more exposure to the many issues we're having in our marriages, in our relationships. Okay, ladies? Thanks to Ben Sound and my brothers too, by the way. My brothers too. If y'all are listening to this and sharing, thank you. I appreciate you. Please share more. Thanks to Ben Sound for the music. I appreciate it so much. So listen, I will be back here and back in your ear next Wednesday. So make sure you tune in. If you're having issues in your marriage, need to reach out, you can go to workwithoev.com to set an appointment with me. Again, that's workwithoev.com. Set an appointment with me and let's talk about your marriage. Let's do some coaching going on, some consultation ministerially going on, and let's get you on the right track if you need to be. I'm here to support you. I'm here for you. So let's continue this discussion by sharing it with others and sharing it with as many as possible. Enjoy the rest of your week, fam. Much love.